Quick note before we dive in. If you are listening to this and it is the end of the summer, the school bags are back out, the new lunchboxes are ready, and a quiet anxiety is creeping in about whether your child has somehow lost ground in Dutch over the holidays, this one is for you. Hit follow on Spotify or Apple or wherever you get your podcast from so you never miss an episode. And if you know another multilingual parent who needs to hear this right now, send it to them. Okay, let's go. Welcome back to the Damn Parenting Podcast. I'm your host, Eva. Before I get into it, a quick mention of Mama Social, who are partnering with me this month. If you know Mama Social already, well, then you know. But if you don't, Rachel runs events and spaces for moms from every culture and background right here in the Netherlands to meet, connect, and actually build that village. Everything we talk about on the show is easier when you have other mothers around you who just get it. Link is in the show notes. Now, there is a very specific end of summer anxiety, and I don't think it gets talked about enough as a multilingual family. And it's not the usual back to school nerves, it's something quieter than that. It's the moment your child tries to say something in Dutch and the word just doesn't come out. Or that they're reaching for it and what comes out is maybe Spanish or French or whatever the language of your summer was. And you feel your stomach drop a little. Have we lost something? Did the 6 weeks abroad undo something we've been spending these years building? Well, today Mimi is back joining us for the next episode of our multilingualism series here. She has done so many episodes with us in the last year. Please be sure to go back and check them all out as they're like building blocks. Every conversation we have opens up something maybe you didn't know you needed to hear. She is a parent to multilingual children and someone who has lived this exact experience with her own children. And today, she's going to tell us what is actually happening in those moments, what the research says, what to do about it, and most importantly, what not to do. Mimi, welcome back to Damn Parenting.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for having me again.
So summer holidays are, finished. Many of our multilingual families are preparing for the new school year. And one concern I hear quite often is, my child has just spent all those weeks immersed in our home language back with our families, and now the school language is somehow a little rusty again. Should I be worried? Mimi, what do you want to say to them?
Well, this is actually a very common concern. And you're right. This is yet another one of those things that we don't talk about often enough. And no, to answer your question, you shouldn't be worried. But let's talk about this a little bit more. As you mentioned, I've been through this myself. And here is one example from my own experience. So last summer, we spent the whole summer break of 6 weeks in Bulgaria. For anyone who doesn't know me, I come from Bulgaria originally. And a few days before returning to the Netherlands, my daughter said to me, Mama, I think I've forgotten a little bit of Dutch. Now, logically, she hadn't really forgotten Dutch. She was born here. She went to Dutch preschool. She'd been in Dutch school, has Dutch friends, and so on and so forth. But from her perspective, she hadn't really needed Dutch for weeks. And suddenly she was about to kind of walk back into her Dutch life where everything happens in Dutch. And she tried to say some stuff in Dutch. She was struggling a little bit because they kind of weren't coming as quickly. And the words were coming in Bulgarian or in English because this is our other home language. And this stayed with me because it's not just normal language dynamic and, what research says it's normal, but it was really a lived example, a 6-year-old articulating something about what she's noticed about her own languages. And she could feel something had shifted. And she had no idea what to make of it. As you said before, and I absolutely agree, this is something that a lot of multilingual families can relate to because people start to worry when this happens. Like you're back from holiday and they kind of start to struggle and they can't really get everything out there. Perhaps even their behavior changes sometimes because they're frustrated. And this is what a lot of people start to worry about. Are we missing something? Are we overlooking something? Have we sort of gone backwards in time? And is this whole thing, all the progress that they've made in the school language, do we now have to make up for it? Or what is happening? So this is definitely a lot of the thought patterns that go on in those cases.
All right. Well, let's get into the mechanics of it because I think when parents understand what is actually happening, it can stop feeling like such a big disaster. So, can you explain what is actually going on? Like what's the brain doing?
So let's stay with this example that I gave you with my daughter to have something tangible to work with for this conversation. So when she said, I think I've forgotten a little bit of Dutch, as I said before, she wasn't overdoing it. And this is actually, if you think about your own language patterns, perhaps you'll notice it in yourself because this is something that a lot of adults experience too. And I have experienced it myself many times, spending a lot of weeks in Bulgaria, then going back to Germany, where I lived for many years before the Netherlands. And this is very, very normal. You spend a few weeks abroad, you come back, and then you kind of struggle to find the words that normally come to you without any effort. You know it's there, but you can't quite grasp it. So indeed, for my daughter, Dutch felt further away than it usually does. And it's like you're going into a room, everything is there, but you can't really find the switch and you can't really find your bearings right away. And this is what actually happens. And one of the things that we know about multilingual development is that languages respond to the environment that we use them in. So in my case, my daughter was surrounded by a Bulgarian for 6 weeks. She was speaking with her grandma, with friends, with cousins, neighbors. She was connecting with people in the environment, kids at the playground, and so on. So this languages was everywhere. And at the same time, Dutch had sort of taken a back seat for this amount of time. She was immersed in another language. So, and Dutch hadn't disappeared, she hadn't forgotten it, but it's simply she wasn't using it, right? And then when we came back to the Netherlands, her brain had to switch gears again. It had to recalibrate. And Dutch suddenly became important again because of school, of friends, of the environment, and Bulgarian had to take a back seat. This is quite normal, but the adjustment takes a little bit of time. How much time? Of course, again, individual depends on the child, depends on the person. But when, as you mentioned before, when, the home language starts popping more in the beginning when you come back and Dutch doesn't come right away, or at least not to the extent that you are used to before you trip, it's not confusion or a sign that something's gone wrong. It's just the multilingual brain adapting to the changing environment because life shifts, needs shift, environments shift. So languages have to shift as well to serve their purpose of communication, of connecting with the people around you. And basically, the system's working exactly the way it should.
Can you explain actually what does it look like in day to day? Like, what are some signs parents might be able to see, and what should they actually be doing with them?
Well, depending on the child, there are a number of things that parents could see, and it definitely helps to be aware of that so that they're not alarmed. Of course, children may hesitate more when speaking. More words from the home language might pop, which was not the case before the break. They might need to search for words more. They might hesitate more. And sometimes even they might have a hard time, depending on their level, depending on, again, on the child, they might have a hard time keeping up in fast-paced conversations or even go quieter or even become frustrated. So every child copes differently with this, but because they know if they're frustrated, that gap that is there between knowing what you want to say and struggling to produce everything right away, it's uncomfortable. They need to adjust. And when a child doesn't know what's happening, it can be taxing on them. So when children don't understand it, they sometimes might interpret it as lacking, as them not being able to cope with the situation rather than just simply being out of practice.
Okay, so knowing what's happening is one thing, but what do parents actually do that can actually make this worse? Are there any traps that we might fall into that we think we're doing something good when we're not?
Yeah, one of the things that parents perhaps dive into right away is panicking, pressuring their children, comparing them to other kids in a similar situation, or perhaps to the way that they were speaking, let's say before they went on the trip. Say something, oh, like your Dutch was so great, for example, what happened? Or over intervention, which is also in a way connected with the panic or the pressure. And parents often see this temporary dip and immediately worry that their child is failing, or that the summer immersion into the home language somehow cost them the ground in the school language. But those ebbs and flows of language are totally normal because, as I said, they're part of what multilingual development looks like in real life, to opposed to what we imagine it looks like. It's never a straight line, it goes up and down and sideways, and then it keeps moving and adjusting. Specifically about the school language, the exposure that children get at school is very, very rich. And very often it's really, really hard to provide the same level of exposure in the home language. At school, children, it's the vocabulary, the conversations, the social aspect of the language, the level of language, the academic language that they're exposed to. It's massive and it's varied and it's rich. So you don't need to compete with this and trying to kind of push in the days before the school starts and overdo it in a way, by drilling or watching excessive amounts of whatever in this language. Pushing your child to perform in a way often might create more anxiety than it can resolve problem. And problem, this is in quotation mark, because it's not really a problem. It's just a period of readjustment. And as I said, comparing how other children are doing or how your child did before is equally unhelpful, because, of course, things feel different. And the question isn't whether they're exactly where they were before. The question is, and I think this is the most important, or one of the most important things that parents should think about: what does my child need right now to settle back in? And I am a big believer in talking to children about those changes. And again, this is yet another one of those opportunities to talk about the language shifts and how they experience them. And I mentioned also the over intervention is another thing that some parents might resort to, which is also pressure in a way, like turning every conversation into a language lesson, quizzing them, pushing them, because what children need in that period of transition is connection. And the language will come because it never disappeared to begin with.
Okay, so you just mentioned there that the children in transition period needs connection, not correction. And we actually covered this topic this time last year. So listeners, go back and be sure to check that one out. It was called Connection Over Correction: Why Your Child's Heritage Language Thrives Through Play. Well worth a listen. So if those are the things not to do, what actually does help? Like, what does the right support look like in those first days and weeks starting back at school?
First of all, normalize the experience. Again, I come back to this point that you should be talking to your child about their languages. You can tell them something like, of course, Dutch feels a bit harder right now. That makes sense because you've been speaking whatever language you spoke, let's say Spanish, all summer. But Dutch will come back. And that kind of acknowledgement is powerful because it names what the child is experiencing and frames it as something normal and not something that you should be worried about or afraid of. And this in itself can reduce some of this tension. And another one is give them time and have some patience, because if you think about athletes, we don't expect them to perform at their peak after 6 weeks without any training. Just give them a little bit of time to have a warm-up period of sorts. And this brings me to the next point. Try to have them reconnect with their friends. See which friends are there, if they've already come back from holiday, because it's so much easier to reconnect with peers and with friends then dive into conversations with adults, which can be a little bit intimidating sometimes for some children. Again, depending on their level, depending on how much their language is developed. But the social aspect of peer conversation in a safe and playful way can be a really helpful way to ease into the school language again. Or even if you come back right before school starts, perhaps you can do some video chats or something for your children to catch up with their friends, and it can be really helpful. Another one, and this is more from the home language side: don't abandon the home language in panic, thinking, oh gosh, like we need to abandon it so because they need to catch up with the school language and get back to where they were. Keep your routines and your connection through the language that you speak together, and the school language will come.
There's something in what you're describing that feels really important. It's the idea that the shift isn't the enemy, I guess. Could you say more about that? Because I think many parents probably do feel like it is a battle.
Well, I think the most useful reframe here that we can have is that you cannot force the school language to stay as present while you're fully immersed in your home country, in your home language, or one of the parents' home countries. Just in the same way that you cannot force the home language to be fully present while your child goes to school in Dutch and lives in the Netherlands. Languages shift to meet the communicative need of the moment. And this is the system working. So when Dutch is suddenly everywhere again, the classroom, the playground, the friends, it comes back. Not because you pushed it, but because it's needed again. And your job as a parent in those moments isn't to intervene, but to be steady and walk your child through it. So, with a parent who says, of course, Dutch feels harder right now. You've been speaking, let's say, Spanish for weeks. Normalize it instead of panicking about it. And again, those moments of shift, as uncomfortable as they might be to some in certain situations, they're great opportunities to help your child understand how their own languages work. That this is all normal, that languages have their ebbs and flows depending on your environment, depending on the need for a specific language. And this is all normal because a child who learns about what's happening is a child who will navigate future shifts with more confidence and trust in their own abilities.
All right, before we finish, I want to ask you just to clarify something, because I think a lot of parents listening need to really hear this clearly stated. Can a child actually lose maybe their Dutch, for example, over their summer holidays back home with their home language?
It's really hard to answer this with a yes or no, because this will be an oversimplification. But let's say it like this. What the research does tell us is that for a school-age child with solid foundation in the school language, especially when they can read and write, a summer holiday, even a longer one, is not enough time for meaningful language loss to occur. And what parents are seeing after 6 or 8 weeks is just the reduced activation. It's not loss. This difference is important because the language is still there after an extended period away. And this language having taken a backseat, let's say, the knowledge is still there. The language is still there. It's simply not being accessed as frequently because the child has been operating in a different linguistic environment. The child has had different needs. So when the environment changes again, the language tends to become active again as well because it is needed again. So this is why many children seem to bounce back, so to say, very quickly once school starts, because they're flooded with the language and they're flooded with a need, a true need to speak it. And true language attrition, the kind that involves more substantial and lasting changes, requires much longer periods of reduced use and exposure. Now, for younger children, this can be a little bit of a different story, like preschoolers and children with relatively limited exposure to a language, or children whose foundations are still developing, might show more shifts over shorter periods of time, But this is a very different scenario from school-age children that we've been talking about today, and a very different avenue that need to be explored properly. It cannot be covered in 5 sentences. So again, for most school-age children, multilingual children, what you're witnessing after a long summer abroad isn't a language that's disappearing. It's a multilingual system that's realigning, readjusting to an environment where it's needed. And as I said before, this is something that's very, very normal.
Well, thank you, Mimi, for joining us again and to talk about this as we do start a new school year. And it's also as important for people with children from the age of 2 or 3, because this always has an impact, as it's always a worry if we're doing any damages, as we would say, to our child's language that they might be speaking here in their voorschool or kinderdagverblijf. So what Mimi said was the language shifts to meet the communicative need of the moment. So the system does work and it's not breaking, it is working. And I think many of us carry this quiet fear that multilingualism is fragile, I think. Would you say that, Mimi?
Yeah, it's not as fragile as people think. But maybe this is something that we can talk about in another episode, because there's a lot to explore there as well.
Well, a new topic. So even if we take our eyes off it for 6 weeks for the summer holidays, and if we let the home language take over for those summer months, and if we let the Dutch go a little bit quiet, something will break and we can't fix it. Well, what Mimi is telling us is that research actually is showing that it's actually not how it works at all. And the children are not losing any of the groundwork. They're adapting, they're realigning, they're doing exactly what a multilingual brain is built to do. Your job right now, just don't push. The Dutch is at the back of the room and your job is just to stay steady. So the parent who is saying, of course it feels hard. Of course, you've been speaking another language for weeks. It'll come back, because it will. Mimi's details are in the show notes. And if you want to work with her or just find more of her thinking, it's all there. As always, Mimi is here every single month, but we will be back next Wednesday. And remember, you're not alone.